The trembling started at 11:02 p.m. on her first night shift at Mercy General. Margaret's hands shook as she wrapped the tourniquet around the patient's forearm, an elderly man with stage 3 heart disease, his vein already scarred from years of dialysis. The needle hovered. She could feel the nurse manager watching from the doorway, clipboard in hand, assessment mode. 3 months probationary period. Every task evaluated. Every move documented. The needle went in sideways. Blood backed up into the hub. She missed. The patient didn't flinch, but she felt his embarrassment like it was her own, which somehow made it worse. First night jitters, the manager said. Not unkind. Just clinical. Recording. Margaret withdrew the needle, pressed gauze to the puncture site, and didn't answer. She reached for a second catheter from the metal tray beside the bed. 14 gauge. Blue hub. Her other hand steadied against the patient's arm, and something shifted in her body. A switch. The trembling stopped like someone had cut the power. Her fingers moved with the kind of precision that belonged to someone who had placed central lines in forward operating bases under incoming fire, not in climate-controlled hospital rooms with proper lighting. The needle slid in at exactly the right angle. Blood flashed. She advanced the catheter smoothly, withdrew the needle, secured it with tape and gauze. Fluid ran clear through the 4-line. Good, the manager said, and left. The patient exhaled. That one felt better. Margaret didn't explain that the third for was always easier. She never mentioned why. The first 2 hurt because she was pretending to be someone she wasn't. By the third attempt, the person she actually was took over. She checked his monitoring leads, confirmed his oxygen saturation at 96%, and left the room with the empty needle wrapper crushed in her fist. The halls of Mercy General hummed with that particular kind of hospital quiet that only existed at night, monitors beeping in steady rhythms that sounded almost like a heartbeat if you listened long enough to the pattern. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered once, steadied, then settled into their permanent whitewash of the corridor. Margaret passed the nursing station, where 3 night shift RNs were charting on computers, their fingers clicking keys with the automaticity of people who had been doing this since before midnight. She went directly to the supply room and began her inventory. Bandages. Saline flushes. Central line kits. Her clipboard came out. She didn't just count items, she verified lot numbers, checked expiration dates, cross-referenced the physical supplies against what the hospital's system said should be there. Meticulous. The kind of meticulous that made people uncomfortable because it implied that everyone else was being careless. 3 months into this new life, Margaret had learned the hospital's rhythms the way she had once learned the rhythms of Helmand Province. Where the danger zones were. When the supervisors made rounds. Which attending physicians preferred silence and which ones liked to talk. She had mapped Mercy General the way soldiers map territory, not with nostalgia, but with the cold precision of someone planning exits and contingencies. She kept a pair of worn combat boots in the bottom of her locker, and every shift before clocking in, she would touch the leather. Not for luck. For remembering. The boots had been there when everything changed. They had survived Marja. They could survive a hospital in Raleigh. She could survive this. She had survived worse. The supply discrepancy appeared on paper first, then in her mind. The surgical equipment log showed 3 laparoscopic cholecystectomy procedures in the past month, but the physical inventory of specialized trocars didn't match the billing records. Margaret wrote the numbers down, 12 units on record, 8 units physically counted. She noted dates. She noted times. She noted which surgeon had been listed as the attending physician on each procedure. Dr. Sterling. All 3 phantom surgeries had Sterling's name signed to the operative notes. She didn't draw conclusions. She just recorded facts. Facts were safer than conclusions. The next shift, Dr. Sterling appeared during her rounds at 2:13 a.m. She was hanging a unit of packed red blood cells for a post-op patient, checking the unit number against the patient's wristband with the same meticulous attention she gave to everything. Sterling observed from the doorway for 30 seconds, long enough that Margaret became aware of being watched. Long enough that the air in the room seemed to change pressure, the way it always did when predators entered space they hadn't claimed yet. "You're very thorough, Nurse Walsh," he said. His voice was smooth, cultured. The kind of voice that had learned to sound pleasant even when the intention behind it was not. Almost too thorough for night shift work. Margaret secured the blood unit to the four-pole and checked the infusion rate on the pump. 60 milliliters per hour. She adjusted the tubing once, though it didn't need adjusting. "I chart what I observe." Sterling stepped into the room. He was a tall man, 6'2", maybe more, with silver hair and the build of someone who had time and money for gym memberships. His scrubs were monogrammed at the chest, which Margaret noticed was unusual for a surgeon in a hospital this size. Everything about Sterling conveyed cost. The watch on his wrist. The shoes beneath his scrubs. The cologne that preceded him into the room, expensive and aggressive. "Observation is important," he said. "So is discretion. You'd be surprised how many details become problems if they're documented too thoroughly." He wasn't smiling. His mouth was the shape of a smile, but his eyes weren't participating in the expression. Margaret had learned this face in different uniforms worn by different men. It was the face of someone whose authority had never been questioned, and who assumed it never would be. "Patients deserve accurate charts," Margaret said. "Of course they do." Sterling moved closer to the bedside, checked the patients for placement with a clinical eye that seemed to find it acceptable. "I'm simply saying that sometimes a nurse's attention to detail can become obsessive. Interfere with her ability to be a team player. Cost her opportunities for advancement." He paused. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. The blood unit dripped steadily through the four-line, 60 milliliters per hour, consistent, measured, honest. "I'd hate to see that happen to someone with your background." He didn't wait for her response. He turned and left the room, his presence leaving a wake of tension in the air like a ship passing through water. Margaret checked the blood unit again. The rate was still 60 milliliters per hour. Everything was exactly as it should be. She just hadn't realized that being exactly as it should be could be a problem for someone like Sterling, someone whose entire position depended on things being less precise than they actually were. 3 more weeks passed. Margaret continued her night shifts, continued her meticulous charting, continued touching the worn combat boots in her locker every shift like a ritual that might protect her from becoming permanently invisible. The hospital absorbed her the way large institutions absorbed anyone quiet enough not to demand attention. She existed in the spaces between other people's dramas. She helped patients and left no fingerprints. She was exactly the kind of employee that hospitals liked, present but not demanding, competent but not threatening, silent but reliable. But her silence had consequences. The supply discrepancies she had documented began creating problems for Sterling that he couldn't explain away. The billing codes didn't match the equipment counts. The operative notes didn't align with the physical evidence. Someone in administration was beginning to notice. Someone was asking questions. And Sterling, sitting in his office at 4:02 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, was staring at Margaret Walsh's meticulous charting on his computer screen and understanding exactly who had created the evidence that was about to become very inconvenient for him. He didn't yet know that he was standing at the edge of a decision that would change everything. He didn't know that quiet people were quiet for reasons. He didn't know that the night nurse with trembling hands on her first shift had learned to stop trembling a long time ago, in a place where trembling meant death and silence meant survival. He was going to find out. But not tonight. Not for 3 more months, when her probationary period ended and she became the kind of threat that couldn't be ignored anymore. For now, Margaret clocked out at 7:04 a.m., touched the combat boots one final time, and walked out into the Raleigh sunrise, her charts filed and her evidence documented. She had no idea what was about to happen. She had spent 3 months becoming invisible, and it would only take one moment to become impossible to ignore. The monthly staff meeting at Mercy General started like all the others, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the cafeteria packed with day shift nurses, residents, and administrative staff crowded around plastic folding chairs. Margaret sat at a corner table with her turkey sandwich, trying to be the kind of invisible she'd perfected over 3 months. The kind that didn't draw attention. The kind that didn't invite questions about trembling hands or the way she moved, sometimes like muscle memory was doing the thinking instead of her mind. Dr. Sterling walked to the microphone at the front of the room. His tie was Italian silk, his shoes cost more than Margaret's monthly rent, and his smile had the particular cruelty of a man who'd never been told no. The room quieted. Sterling commanded that kind of silence the way some men commanded armies. "I've got a wager for you all," he announced, his voice carrying the easy confidence of someone who controlled the hospital's most profitable department. "Our newest night nurse, what do we call you, the old lady? I'm giving her 1 week. 1 week before she quits." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "Any takers?" Laughter rippled through the cafeteria like a current. Margaret felt it more than heard it, felt it the way water feels a stone dropped from a cliff. Her sandwich stopped halfway to her mouth. She didn't look up. She didn't move. She just existed in the space between the first laugh and the second, between the moment before and the moment after. Sterling walked past her table. He was angling toward the coffee station, his trajectory taking him directly past her chair. Margaret could smell his cologne, something expensive with notes of leather and entitlement. She could hear the soft scrape of his leather soles on the tile floor. She could see, in her peripheral vision, the angle of his body as he approached. His elbow came up like a reflex, like an accident waiting to happen. It connected with her lunch tray with the kind of force that suggested calculation dressed up as carelessness. The turkey sandwich flew. The soup, tomato bisque, still steaming, splattered across her scrubs in a pattern like arterial spray. The ceramic bowl shattered against the tile with a crash that silenced the room faster than any command ever could. For 3 heartbeats, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even the fluorescent lights seemed to hold their hum. Sterling didn't apologize. He didn't help her up. He just stood there, watching the soup drip from her uniform like he was admiring his own work. Then he reached down, slowly, deliberately, and dropped a patient chart at her feet. The pages scattered across the wet floor, some of them absorbing the bisque, the ink beginning to run. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Sterling said, his voice low enough that only Margaret could hear it beneath the ambient noise of the room resetting itself. "And try to get the billing codes right this time. Wouldn't want to embarrass yourself." Margaret sat there for 1 second. 2. 3. Then she took one measured breath through her nose. The kind of breath that came from places her conscious mind had learned not to go. Muscle memory in a single inhale, discipline and control settling into her spine like it had a home there. A single tear escaped down her left cheek. She watched it fall as if it belonged to someone else, as if her body was betraying her in real time while her mind remained perfectly still. She wiped it away with the back of her hand without breaking eye contact with Sterling. Her eyes held his for exactly as long as it took for the tear to dry. "I've had harder days than you can imagine, doctor," she said. Her voice was steady as stone. Steady as a surgical laser. Steady as someone who'd held things together in places where the ground itself was trying to kill you. Sterling's jaw tightened. Just for a moment. Then he turned and walked away, leaving her kneeling on the tile with broken ceramic and cooling soup and the taste of 1,000 compromises she'd made to stay invisible. Margaret cleaned it up herself. The other nurses watched but didn't help, partly from shock, partly from the calculation that helping might put them on Sterling's radar next. She gathered the soggy patient charts. She wiped up the bisque. She worked methodically, the way she worked through everything. Not fast. Not slow. Just inevitable. 3 days later, Sterling forgot to include her in the critical handoff for a post-operative cardiac patient. She showed up to her shift and found the patient already assessed by someone else, his care plan already documented by residents who'd been briefed while Margaret was somewhere else. Sterling had her written up for missing the meeting. The documentation in her personnel file read, demonstrated lack of initiative and institutional awareness. A week after that, Sterling reassigned her to the Saturday night cases, the kind of patients that burned out nurses and made career-minded doctors transfer hospitals. The belligerent drunk with a split forehead who swung at anyone who touched him. The woman in withdrawal from heroin, her body convulsing like electricity was running through her bones. The man with the stab wound who kept insisting he'd fallen down the stairs even though the blade pattern suggested otherwise. "Let's see how long Grandma lasts with the Saturday night specials," Sterling said in front of 3 residents, his smile suggesting he'd made a joke they should all find hilarious. Margaret didn't flinch. She just reported for her shift at 11 p.m. on Saturday, pulled on fresh scrubs, and moved through her cases with the same precision she'd brought to every shift. She talked the drunk down instead of restraining him. She sat with the woman in withdrawal, timing her medications and her presence like both mattered equally. She documented the stab wound with such clinical exactness that the trauma surgeon actually looked up from the chart and said, "This is the best pre-op assessment I've seen all month." But her documentation was getting more detailed, more comprehensive, more dangerous. She was pulling records now, cross-referencing dates and procedure codes. She was noticing that certain patients had been billed for operative time they'd never spent in surgery. That anesthesia charges appeared for outpatient consultations. That phantom surgical equipment had been documented as used on patients who'd never left the clinic. The patterns were becoming unmistakable, and Margaret's methodical charting was building a map of the discrepancies that Sterling couldn't explain away. He knew it too. She could see it in the way his eyes tracked her from across the hospital floor. In the way he'd appear in the break room and then leave the moment she entered. In the way he started having conversations with other senior doctors that would go quiet when she passed. He needed her gone before she connected the final dots. Then the ambulance bay doors crashed open at 9:27 p.m. on a Tuesday night, and everything Margaret had been managing to keep separate came flooding back. The ambulance doors crashed open at 9:44 p.m., and the night shift froze. Paramedics wheeled the stretcher through Mercy General's trauma bay with practiced urgency, calling vitals in rapid-fire succession. Commander David Chen, Coast Guard training accident, penetrating trauma to the left lower abdomen, estimated blood loss 2 liters, BP dropping, ETA to OR is 4 minutes. Margaret heard the call and moved. Not because she was assigned to this patient. Not because it was protocol. Because the tone in that voice meant someone was bleeding out, and bleeding out was the one language she had never forgotten how to speak. She caught the stretcher at the threshold between ambulance dock and hospital corridor. The commander's abdomen was wrapped in field dressings already turning dark red. His eyes were fixed, pupils dilating. Shock setting in. Margaret's hands moved before her mind caught up, 16 years of training taking over where thought ended. She was already running calculations. 2 liters meant the femoral artery, almost certainly. Abdominal entry wound with that trajectory meant the left side, below the inguinal ligament. Surgical team was already being called. She had maybe 90 seconds before they arrived. "Get him to pre-op," she said, her voice clipped and level. "Type and cross 6 units. I need a 14-gauge angiocath, silk sutures, and a field kit on standby. Move." The residents and interns scrambled. Margaret jogged beside the stretcher, her eyes already assessing. The commander's breathing was shallow. Oxygen saturation dropping on the monitor. 82%. 79. His left leg lay at an angle that suggested massive internal hemorrhage pooling in the retroperitoneal space. Not visible bleeding, which meant worse bleeding. The kind that killed people before you could see the damage. Pre-op was chaos in the controlled way hospitals managed chaos. She scrubbed fast, muscle memory pulling her through every motion, soap, brush between fingers, up to the elbows, the smell of antiseptic sharp and familiar as a salute. The same ritual she'd performed in forward surgical tents in Helmand Province, in the back of hums bouncing across Sanjin Valley, in the dirt-floored aid stations where triage meant choosing who would live and who would be made comfortable while they died. That life felt like someone else's dream now. Except it didn't. It felt like exactly this. She dried her hands, pulled on fresh gloves, and approached the commander's bedside. The surgical team hadn't arrived yet. That was the problem and the opportunity. The initial stabilization was hers alone. "Commander," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of authority that didn't need volume. "I'm going to place a temporary clamp on your femoral artery. This will hurt. You're going to want to scream. Don't. Screaming increases your blood pressure and makes you bleed faster. Can you do that?" He nodded, his jaw clenched so tight she could see the muscles working under his skin. His eyes, though. His eyes locked onto hers with the clarity of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of crisis. Military. Definitely military. The recognition flickered between them like a shared code. She found the site with her fingers, located the pulse of the femoral artery beneath his groin, and pulled the 14-gauge needle through the skin with one smooth motion. The needle went in. The hiss of blood escaping under pressure. She'd done this before, in a makeshift hospital outside Marja during the 2011 surge, 3 times in one night, hand steady while mortars screamed overhead. The muscle memory wasn't just technique. It was presence. It was the absolute certainty that panic killed more people than blood loss. She threaded the finest silk suture through the needle, then tied it with a specific pattern, a field-expedient knot that had saved lives when she had nothing but suture material and her own 2 hands. Loop and cross, through and back, a pattern unique enough that it could never be taught by textbook. It could only be learned by doing it under fire. The commander's eyes widened. His hand shot up and gripped her wrist with surprising strength for a man losing consciousness. His mouth moved, and when the words came, they were barely a whisper. "Marja." His voice cracked. "I know that stitch pattern. You were there." Margaret's hands went completely still. Not trembling. Not shaking. Still as stone. She kept her eyes on the clamp, kept her voice level, kept her breathing exactly where it needed to be. But inside, something sealed shut, a door she had worked 3 months to keep closed, locked from the inside. "Stay focused, Commander," she said quietly. "Breathe. In through your nose, out through your mouth. You're going in 5 minutes." But his grip on her wrist didn't release. His eyes held hers with the intensity of a man who had just recognized something he thought was dead. Something that had walked back into his life in scrubs and a name badge that didn't match the stitch pattern on his femoral artery. "I remember," he whispered. "You came to the compound. After Sanjin. The commander of Bravo Company sent you to patch up our wounded. You didn't say much. Just worked. All night. Your hands were." He trailed off, coughing, his body convulsing with the effort. "Don't talk," Margaret said, and this time her voice had changed, dropped an octave, hardened into something closer to command than comfort. "You need your oxygen. Save your breath. I have this." She checked the clamp. Holding. The bleeding had slowed to a trickle. The O2 monitor climbed, 87%, now 89%. His heart rate was still elevated but stabilizing. The field-expedient technique was working, which meant she had bought time, which meant the surgical team arriving in the next minute had a live patient instead of a corpse. And then the door to pre-op burst open and Dr. Sterling walked in, his shadow falling across the stretcher like a threat. Behind him came the surgical team, Dr. Reeves from cardiology, Dr. Patterson from trauma, Dr. Kim from thoracic surgery, Dr. Okonkwo from vascular, and Dr. Martinez from critical care. 5 doctors. The entire night roster. Sterling's eyes moved from the commander to Margaret to the clamp she had placed. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air, a pressure drop, like the moment before a storm. "What is this?" Sterling's voice was smooth, conversational, dangerous. "A nurse performing a surgical clamp? That's concerning for patient safety, wouldn't you say?" Dr. Reeves exchanged a glance with Dr. Patterson. Something unspoken passed between them. "Sir," Margaret said, stepping back from the stretcher with the precision of a retreat that wasn't retreat. Commander Chen is losing blood from a femoral artery laceration. Temporary field clamp was necessary to stabilize before surgical intervention. I've documented the placement in the chart. Of course you have, Sterling said. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Your meticulous charting is almost famous around here. Always so thorough. He turned to the surgical team. Doctors, thank you for coming. I need to speak with you in the hallway. Briefly. Margaret watched the 5 of them step out. The commander's hand found her wrist again, weaker this time. Don't let him stop you, Chen whispered. Whatever he's going to do. Don't stop. She didn't answer. She couldn't. Because she already knew, some part of her had known from the moment Sterling walked in, that he was about to make a choice that would either save this man's life or destroy her career. And he was going to choose her destruction. The voices in the hallway were muffled but audible if you knew how to listen. Sterling's voice steady, measured, speaking in low urgent tones about liability and complications and procedures performed outside the scope of authorization. Dr. Reeves hesitating. Dr. Patterson asking about legal implications. Dr. Kim mentioning board review. Dr. Okonkwo talking about family obligations. Dr. Martinez, after a pause that felt like a betrayal, saying, I can't risk my license. One by one, the footsteps moved away from the pre-op bay. Sterling returned alone. He pulled his phone from his pocket and hit record, the red light blinking on like an eye-opening. For the record, he said quietly, his voice perfectly pitched for a legal filing, this surgical procedure is being conducted without proper authorization. The patient has been making unusual claims that create liability concerns. A properly credentialed surgeon will take over once available. Document this, please. He looked directly at Margaret. Every single thing you do from this moment forward. Then he walked out, leaving her in the pre-op bay with a commander bleeding into his abdomen and nothing but a field clamp, her hands, and the absolute certainty that she was about to lose everything she'd spent 3 months building. She didn't hesitate. She looked at Commander Chen and said the only thing that mattered. I've got you. We're moving to surgery. Now. The cardiac monitor screamed at 2:03 a.m. Commander Chen's chest rose on the left side only, his right side completely still. Asymmetrical breathing. The kind of breathing that meant his right lung had collapsed under pressure, air trapped between the lung and the chest wall, pushing against his heart with every heartbeat. His lips had turned the color of wet concrete. His fingers clawed at the bed rails. Margaret was at his bedside before the alarm finished its second pulse. She'd seen this before, Sanjin Valley, 2011, a Marine with an IED fragmentation wound, same asymmetrical rise, same grey lips. Pain is data. She read his chest like it was a combat casualty report written in blood and distress. Get me a surgical team. Now. Her voice had dropped 2 octaves from this morning's deferential murmur. This was a different voice, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Full team to Trauma 3. She pressed the overhead button. Code Blue, Trauma Bay 3. Pneumothorax with cardiac compromise. Need surgery standing by. The night shift scattered like startled birds, 2 residents grabbed the crash cart, a nursing assistant wheeled the ultrasound machine, the anesthesia team was running. Margaret's hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this intense, in hums, in the dirt outside forward operating bases. She already had her trauma shears out, already cutting away his gown. But Dr. Sterling appeared in the doorway with his phone. He didn't come to help. He stood there, watching, and made a phone call. Then another. Then 3 more, in total. 5 separate calls made from that hallway while Commander Chen's oxygen saturation dropped toward the red zone. Margaret didn't hear the conversations, but she watched Sterling's face. Watched him hold up one finger to each arriving doctor as they approached the trauma bay. Watched him speak quietly, mouth close to his phone, eyes locked on Margaret. Dr. Reeves was first. Good hands. Former trauma surgeon before he'd moved to emergency medicine. He took 1 step into the bay, saw Sterling's signal, paused. His jaw clenched. He turned and left without speaking. Dr. Patterson followed 3 minutes later. Chest surgery attending. She read the monitor, looked at the ultrasound. Margaret was already running with one hand while holding pressure, and her eyes met Sterling's in the mirror reflection above the bed. She nodded slightly, backed away, and disappeared down the corridor. Dr. Kim came next. ICU trained. Competent. She stayed for 10 seconds, long enough to understand the severity, long enough to see Sterling's expression, long enough to make her choice. The door closed behind her like a coffin lid. Margaret didn't stop working. Didn't acknowledge them. Didn't beg or plead. Her hand stayed steady as surgical lasers on Commander Chen's chest while the weight of 5 doctors' abandonment pressed down like atmospheric pressure before a hurricane. Dr. Okonkwo, the interventional radiologist, appeared in scrubs. He looked at Sterling. That was all it took. One look. He left. Dr. Martinez, anesthesia, was the last to arrive. Margaret watched his shoulders tense when Sterling touched his arm in the hallway. She watched him turn away from the patient. Watched the last door close. 5 doctors. 5 refusals. One patient whose heart was being crushed inside his own chest. I need a 14-gauge angiocath needle, Margaret said to the nursing assistant, whose name was Jennifer, who was 24 and shaking. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Nurse Walsh, you're not authorized, the resident started, but Margaret was already moving. She didn't raise her voice. Didn't need to. Step back. The resident stepped back. The needle was in her hand, 14-gauge, hollow bore, ready. She prepped the skin with iodine, felt the landmarks of his ribs beneath her fingertips like reading braille in the dark. The needle advanced. First the skin gave way. Then the fascia. Then the pleural membrane. The hiss. That specific sound of air rushing out under pressure, the pneumothorax decompressing, the lung re-expanding. Commander Chen gasped like a drowning man who'd just broken the surface of the water. His oxygen saturation jumped from 68 to 71 to 78 to 88. His lips began to turn pink again. But his blood pressure was still dropping. His heart sounds were muffled, barely audible beneath the stethoscope. His jugular veins were distended like cables under the skin of his neck. Cardiac tamponade. Fluid compressing his heart. Sterling appeared in the doorway again, phone in hand, recording. Nurse Walsh, you are not authorized to perform surgical procedures. You will cease immediately and allow. Then stop me, Margaret said quietly, and her hands were already moving to the ultrasound probe, already positioning it over his lower chest, already locating the fluid pocket around his heart. 60 milliliters of blood with nowhere to go except to kill him. She advanced the needle under the xiphoid process, the bony landmark at the bottom of his sternum, angled upward, steady, feeling for the resistance that meant she'd reached the pericardial sac. The needle sank deeper. She felt it, that subtle resistance, that moment of tissue resistance giving way to membrane. She aspirated. Dark blood flowed back through the syringe. 60 milliliters. 70. 80. She pulled back when the flow stopped, when she felt the lung tissue through the needle, when she knew 1 more millimeter would mean she'd gone too far. Commander Chen's blood pressure climbed like a fighter jet gaining altitude. His oxygen came back. His heart rate steadied. His eyes opened, confused but alive, and he looked at Margaret with a kind of gratitude that comes from being pulled back from the edge of the grave. She didn't look at him. She was already checking the monitor, already running new vitals, already assessing for fluid reaccumulation. Her hands moved on autopilot through the next 4 hours, managing his for fluids with the precision of someone who'd calculated liters per kilogram on the back of a blood-spattered notepad in Kandahar. Adjusting his pressors when his blood pressure dipped. Monitoring every single sound his heart made. By 4 a.m., his chest X-ray showed the lung fully re-expanded, the fluid in his pericardium reduced to trace amounts. By 5:13 a.m., He was stable enough for transfer to the surgical ICU, where a real trauma surgeon could manage his underlying abdominal wound in a proper operating room. By 6 a.m., Commander Chen was sleeping with the steady, deep breathing of someone who'd survived. Margaret stood at his bedside for one more minute, watching his chest rise and fall symmetrically. Right side and left side in perfect balance. She didn't celebrate. She didn't shake. She turned and left him there with the monitors keeping watch. She made it to the locker room before reality hit. Her hands were still steady when she removed her scrubs. Still steady when she shoved her worn combat boots into a plastic bag someone handed her, the director of nursing standing there with a forced expression of regret, explaining that Dr. Sterling had filed formal complaints, that the board would need to investigate, that she was being placed on immediate administrative leave pending review. "Security will escort you out," the director said quietly. Margaret didn't argue. Didn't defend herself. Just took the bag with her boots inside, that single piece of her old life still intact, and walked toward the exit with her head level and her shoulders back. She didn't see Sterling in the hallway. But she heard him on his phone, voice pitched low and urgent, already dialing his network. Calling her references at other hospitals. Filing an inquiry with the state nursing board. Making arrangements with a private investigator to dig into her background, to find something, anything, that would explain who this mysterious night nurse really was. But there was nothing to find. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh had been deleted from every official database the moment she'd left active duty. No military record. No service history. No proof that she'd ever held a weapon or saved a life in combat. The Coast Guard had classified her service record, sealed it behind encryption and federal statute, and the woman who'd walked back into Mercy General 3 months ago was just a ghost, a phantom with steady hands and a past that no longer existed on paper. The parking lot was empty. The rain had stopped sometime after midnight, leaving the asphalt gleaming like dark mirror glass under the sodium lights. Margaret walked through it without feeling the cold. Her ID badge was gone. Her scrubs were gone. Her locker was empty. All she had was the plastic bag with her boots. She sat in her car for exactly 3 minutes before her phone rang. Unknown number. For a moment, just a moment, her hand hesitated over the answer button. Then she answered. A woman's voice. Crying. "Is this Senior Chief Walsh?" Margaret's breath caught. "This is Daniel's school. Your son has requested emergency pickup. He's been asking for you since 11 p.m. Margaret was already driving before the woman finished speaking. The security guard didn't ask questions when Dr. Sterling handed him the personnel file. He just walked Margaret to the employee exit at 6:24 a.m., his radio crackling with morning shift chatter while her badge was deactivated with a soft electronic beep. 3 months. 92 shifts. Enough time to save a commander's life and lose everything for it. The file in her hands was a masterpiece of fabrication, insubordination, unauthorized procedures, reckless endangerment. Each word a lie. Each signature a forgery. The parking lot was empty except for the early morning rain turning the asphalt the color of old bruises. Dr. Sterling didn't wait for the hearing. He activated his network like a man triggering dead drops across a city. First call went to St. Mary's Hospital in Chapel Hill at 7:15 a.m., Margaret's previous employer. Sterling's voice was smooth as oil on water. "I'm calling about a reference for Margaret Walsh. She was with us 3 months, and I have to be frank, there were serious concerns about her judgment in the OR. I wouldn't feel comfortable recommending her for any position involving patient care." The administrator at St. Mary's, a man named Hutchins who'd never spoken to Margaret directly, made a note in her personnel file. Reference, do not rehire. By noon, Sterling had called 3 more hospitals. By 2 p.m., he'd filed a complaint with the North Carolina Nursing Board documenting Margaret's unauthorized procedures performed outside her scope of practice during the commander's resuscitation. By 3 p.m., he'd hired a private investigator named Marcus Webb for $8,000 to dig into her background, her financials, her history. Webb was good at what he did, he could find anyone who wanted to be found. But Margaret Walsh didn't want to be found. She had made certain of that. Webb spent 2 weeks searching. He found her nursing school records in Chapel Hill, her RN license issued in 2015, her address on Maple Street in Raleigh. He found her marriage license. Margaret Ellen Chen married James Michael Walsh, October 12, 2017. He found his death certificate, dated April 3, 2021. Massive cerebral hemorrhage. He found her lease on the apartment she rented month to month, her car registered to her name, her bank account with $3,847 in savings. And then the trail ended. The digital footprint stopped. No social media. No prior employment history before her nursing degree. No military records. No government database entries. It was as if Margaret Walsh had simply materialized in 2015, fully formed, with a name and documents but no past. When Webb reported this to Dr. Sterling, Sterling felt a cold electric shock run down his spine. "She's ghosted," Webb said. Completely erased from official records before 2015. Professional work, probably intelligence community, maybe government relocation. "I can't go further without federal eyes coming down on my business, and I'd rather not." Sterling had paid him anyway and hung up the phone, more unsettled than before. Margaret didn't go home. She drove to Oakwood Cemetery in the rain, past the entrance and up the hill where James was buried under a granite stone that read his name and 2 dates and nothing else. No medals. No rank. No beloved husband and father. Just James Michael Walsh. She stood there in her street clothes, mud soaking through the worn combat boots she'd kept in the bottom of her locker for 11 years, the only piece of her old life that she'd allowed herself to keep. The rain hammered down. The cemetery was empty at 5 p.m. on a Tuesday. She could hear the water dripping from the letters of his name. "I couldn't do it anymore, James," she said. The words came out like a confession. "I brought him back. I did everything right. Everything you taught me. And I failed." She didn't move. She didn't cry. She just stood there in the mud with her shoulders straight and her jaw locked, speaking to stone and absence. "I thought if I stayed quiet, if I just worked, if I kept my head down, I could build something different. Something normal. Something for Danny." The rain plastered her hair to her face. "But staying quiet just meant I let him hurt more people. And now I don't know who I am anymore. I don't know if I'm the person you married or the person you trained me to be. I don't know how to be both." She placed one hand on the stone, her palm flat against the cold granite, and whispered, "I'm sorry." 3 days later, the hospital board convened an emergency hearing. Margaret sat in a conference room on the 3rd floor of Mercy General, in a chair that faced a long oak table where 6 board members sat reviewing her file with expressions that ranged from concerned to hostile. The hospital's chief counsel was prepared to defend Dr. Sterling's actions. The medical board's representative had already heard Sterling's version of events. The outcome had been decided before Margaret walked in. Then the door opened. Her 17-year-old son Daniel walked in carrying a shadow box, the kind you use to frame military medals and insignia. He was wearing his school uniform, his tie slightly crooked, and his eyes were red from crying on the drive over. Margaret's breath caught. She had kept those medals in a sealed plastic tote in the attic, wrapped in oilcloth and silence, never to be opened, never to be explained. She had planned to leave them there until after she died. "Mom, they need to see these," Daniel said. His voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. "Mrs. Patterson called me from the school. She said the news was saying you did something wrong, that you hurt a patient, and I just kept thinking, about all those times I found you in the basement at 2 in the morning, staring at nothing, and I found your old yearbook, and I went up to the attic, and I found this box." He opened the shadow box. The light from the conference room's fixtures caught the ribbons, the bronze stars, the enameled medals. The board director, a man named Ronald Hastings whose own father had served in the Air Force, read from the sealed file Daniel had found, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke. Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh, United States Coast Guard. Silence. The kind of silence that happens when the air pressure in a room changes. A retired Navy SEAL named Admiral Bradford sat on the hospital's advisory board, a position he'd held for 3 years without ever needing to speak. His eyes moved to the shadow box, and he stood slowly, his chair scraping against the tile floor with a sound like a rifle chambering around. He stepped closer to the medals, his weathered face reading each ribbon with the fluency of someone who'd worn them himself. When he spoke, his voice came out low and fractured. Navy Cross. He pointed. Valor under fire in Marja. 2 Purple Hearts, 1 from shrapnel, 1 from blast concussion. Defense Meritorious Service Medal. Combat Action Ribbon. He looked at Margaret for the first time, and his eyes were wet. Senior Chief, the Navy Cross is reserved for the most extraordinary heroism. You don't get that by being careful. You get that by putting your body between a bullet and someone else. Dr. Sterling's face went white. He opened his mouth. The words died before they formed. That was when the FBI agent stepped forward. Agent Morrison had been sitting in the back of the conference room the entire time, silent, observing, waiting for this moment. She was small and precise, with dark hair pulled back and a badge on her belt that caught the fluorescent light. When she spoke, her voice had the weight of federal authority. Dr. James Sterling, our investigation into Medicare fraud patterns at Mercy General has been greatly assisted by the meticulous patient charting and billing analysis provided by Senior Chief Petty Officer Margaret Walsh. Her documentation identified 47 phantom surgical procedures billed to Medicare, totaling $2,347,000 in fraudulent claims. She also documented your attempts to forge her personnel records in the last 48 hours in order to create false cause for her termination and obstruct this investigation. That constitutes federal obstruction of justice. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The handcuffs came out. Silver. Smooth. The sound they made when they clicked together around Sterling's wrists was like a coffin lid closing. This is ridiculous, I'm chief of surgery, you can't. Sterling's composure fractured like tempered glass. The arrogance crumbled. What remained was rage and panic and the sudden, horrible realization that he had built his career on the one person in the hospital who actually kept records that mattered. Agent Morrison read him his rights while opening a thick folder containing bank records, Medicare claim forms, emails to medical device companies, and invoices for surgeries that never happened. Sterling was led toward the door, marshals on either side of him, and he turned back to face Margaret one last time. His face was contorted with something like despair. You self-righteous, you have no idea what you've. The door closed. The word stopped. Outside Mercy General, a news crew was already waiting in the parking lot, cameras and microphones arranged like weapons. Someone had tipped them off, probably Agent Morrison. Probably intentional, probably necessary. Dr. James Sterling emerged from the building in handcuffs, ducking his head as reporters shouted questions. The perp walk was captured in high definition, the polo shirt, the silver cuffs, the federal marshals on either side of him, the look of a man watching his entire life collapse in real time. The footage played on every local news channel that night. Channel 5 led with it. Channel 11 ran it twice. By 11 p.m., it was circulating on social media with captions like Raleigh surgeon arrested for $2.3 million Medicare fraud. The hospital launched a full internal investigation. The 5 doctors who had walked away from Commander Chen, Dr. Reeves, Dr. Patterson, Dr. Kim, Dr. Okonkwo, and Dr. Martinez, were all suspended pending review. They claimed Sterling had given them guidance, that they didn't know about the fraud, that they were following orders from the chief of surgery. No one believed them. Their careers were stained permanently, their judgment questioned, their licenses suspended for 30 days pending board review. Sterling's medical license was suspended immediately by the North Carolina Board of Medicine. His trial was scheduled for 6 months later, but the evidence was overwhelming. Margaret's charting, 3 months of meticulous, detailed patient notes, had created a paper trail that forensic accountants could follow to every phantom procedure, every inflated bill, every kickback arrangement with medical device manufacturers. Released on bail at $250,000, Dr. Sterling began the humiliating work of finding employment. His mansion on Forest Hill Road went on the market, listed at $2.1 million, eventually selling for $1.6 million. His country club membership was revoked. His wife filed for divorce. His medical license suspended. His reputation destroyed. The man who had once commanded 5 operating rooms and bullied 5 senior physicians into abandoning a patient now sat at a folding table outside a strip mall on Capitol Boulevard, wearing a cheap polo shirt with a company logo stitched across the chest, selling supplemental insurance policies to disinterested shoppers who barely made eye contact. His handcuffs and perp walk photo was still circulating on social media, shared with comments like "How the mighty have fallen" and "This is what karma looks like." 6 months later, Margaret Walsh stood in her new office at Mercy General Hospital. Her title placard read Director of Emergency Medicine. The corner office overlooked the ambulance bay where Commander Chen had arrived that night, bleeding and unconscious, the night that changed everything. On her wall, mounted in a glass display case with soft lighting, were those worn combat boots, scuffed leather, frayed laces, mud still caked in the treads from a cemetery in the rain. Beneath them, a brass plaque read, "For those who stay when others walk away." And now, we turn to you. Think about the moments in your own life when others have walked away. When everyone else chose the easy path, the safe option, the way that required no risk. Have you ever been that person who stayed? Have you ever stayed for someone who needed you, even when staying cost you everything? Because that's what Margaret Walsh understood. Staying isn't about heroism. It's about seeing someone who needs help and deciding that their life matters more than your comfort. That's the real definition of a warrior. If you've ever faced a moment like that, or if you've known someone brave enough to stay when others walked away, comment below. Share your story. And if this video reminded you that there are quiet heroes all around us, nurses, teachers, mothers, fathers, ordinary people doing extraordinary things in the dark, please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with someone who needs to know that sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns.